The great herbal lay open on its stand in the middle of the library like a jewel taken out of its box, and every person of rank for 20 miles had come to bend over it and marvel. And the celebrated Mr. Julian Frost stood beside it, accepting the wonder of the county as though he had grown every flower on its pages out of his own 2 hands. And at the back of the room, near the door where the servants passed, a young woman in a brown stuff gown with faint stains of pigment worked into the creases of her knuckles watched the whole assembly praise 14 months of her own work and said nothing at all. She was the only person in that paneled room who knew whose eye had seen those flowers and whose hand had laid down every wash of color upon them. She was also, though not one soul present would have believed it, the only person who could prove it. She looked at the open page, at the great crimson poppy painted so true it seemed to breathe, worked so fine you could count the black freckles at its heart. She looked at the small pressed thing hidden between 2 leaves near the back of the book, a single dried flower she alone knew was there, because she alone had laid it in by candlelight against the express order of the woman who was now dead. Then Clemency Ash did the one thing a hired colorist must never do in front of her betters, and to understand why and why it did not ruin her, you must go back 14 months. To the raw February morning she was hired the way one hires a length of good ribbon. The workroom of Mr. Peveril the engraver stood in a court behind the booksellers in the town of Hartwell, and Clemency had a table by the east window, because the morning light shows a color its true face before the day has a chance to flatter it. She had been at that table since before 6, grinding a little rose madder on a slab of ground glass to see whether the new batch ran too blue, when Mr. Peveril came up the stair with his spectacles pushed into his hair and told her to wipe the color off her hands, because a lady's woman had come from the great house asking for the best hand in the shop. And the best hand in the shop, whatever the world might think of it, was a foundling of 23, who owned 1 gown and a box of colors she had ground herself. The lady's woman was called Mrs. Quill, and she was small and dry and exact, and she looked a long while at the half-finished plate of a wild geranium pinned to Clemency's board before she troubled to look at Clemency's face. She wanted, she said, a colorist of the first order, not for a shop, but for a household. There was a work to be done at the great house, a work that would take the better part of a year, and it must be done under 1 roof and by 1 pair of hands and spoken of to no one. The old Countess of Renholt, she said, was making a book, and the book was to be a secret until it was given, and the terms were these: bed and board at the house, £15 for the year, a plain gray gown to be worn where the family might see her, entrance by the garden door, and not 1 word to the servants' hall about what she painted behind a locked door. "It is not a place for a lady," Mrs. Quill said, not unkindly, which somehow made it land the harder. "It is a place for a pair of hands that can keep a secret as clean as they keep a line." Clemency did the sum without letting it show on her face. She had come to Mr. Peveril's at 15 from the parish, with no name but the one the workhouse matron had copied off a scrap of paper pinned to her blanket, and she had never once in 8 years had £15 owed to her at a single stroke. £15 was a door. £15 was, if she was careful, the beginning of a shop of her own one day, a good window and an east light and her own name over the door, which is the only inheritance a foundling can leave herself. She said she would be honored. She had learned early that honor was a thing you could hold in your mouth like a coin and spend where it must be spent, and she had spent it on worse bargains than this one. Her whole fortune in the world was a color box, and inside it, under the tray of cakes and shells of pigment, lay a single sheet of paper she had drawn when she was 9. her only clear memory of the woman who had left her at the parish gate, a small, careful study of a flower with 5 spurred petals, a columbine drawn in a way the matron had never seen and could not name. Every stamen counted true. She did not know her mother's face. She knew the way her mother had looked at a flower, because it lived in her own eye, the way some people carry a dead parent's turn of the head. That was the whole of what she had, and she carried it to Wrenholt House in a bundle under her arm on a gray February morning, and went in as instructed by the garden door. And the great house took her in the way a cathedral takes in a sparrow. She was given a small dry room at the top of the west wing with a north skylight and a stout lock, and a wide sloped table, and quires of the finest hot-pressed paper, and pans of color and stones to grind more. And she was told that the old countess would see her, which never happened. A countess sending for a hired brush. The old Countess of Wrenholt was 79 and small and upright as a walking cane, and she sat by her fire with a rug over her knees and looked at Clemency for the length of time it takes a kettle to decide to sing. And then she said, "Show me your hands." Clemency held them out, and the old woman turned them palm up and looked at the pigment gone deep into the lines of them, the stain that no scrubbing takes out of a working colorist. And then she said, "When you paint the underside of a leaf, girl, do you gray the green or do you blue it?" And Clemency, who had never in her life been asked such a question by anyone above the rank of Mr. Peveril, said, "I blue it a little and gray it less, madam, for the underside holds the sky more than the earth, whatever the eye expects." And the old woman's eyes changed. They did not soften exactly, they sharpened, the way a room sharpens when a second candle is lit. "Sit," said the Countess of Wrenholt, and Clemency sat, and that was the beginning of the strangest and dearest year of her life. The work was a book, not a book of psalms or of household accounts, but a florilegium, a great bound herbal of the flowers of the Wrenholt land, every plant that grew wild in its woods and along its river and up its chalk hill, drawn from the living stem and colored true, one plate to a page, with the old countess describing which flowers were to go in and in what order across the first several afternoons, in a firelit room with the door locked. And by the second afternoon Clemency's hands had begun to still over her board, very quietly, because among the flowers the old woman named, leaf by leaf and season by season, spoken as if she were reciting a prayer she had said all her life, was a columbine with 5 spurred petals, and the old countess described the exact tilt of its nodding head and the exact violet at the base of the spur in the very words Clemency might have used herself, in the very way the flower sat on the sheet at the bottom of her own color box. She did not say so. A foundling learns to hold a coincidence the way she holds a coin, quietly, until she knows what it is worth. But she began from that hour to watch the old countess the way she watched the morning light, without seeming to, and she saw a great deal. She saw that the book was meant for the granddaughter of the house, a girl of 16 called Lady Grace, who was gentle and shy and loved the garden more than the drawing room, and came sometimes to the west room to watch her flowers grow on the page, and was not in the least proud. And she saw that there was another young person always at the great house that spring, a distant connection of the family taken up and encouraged, a handsome and clever and hungry young man of 26 called Mr. Julian Frost, who had come with letters of introduction and a folio of pretty drawings and a soft way of talking about art that made great people feel they understood it, and who had let it be known, delicately, everywhere, that he was an artist of rare gifts, chief among them a genius with flowers. Clemency knew what Mr. Frost's brush could do, because twice that spring his half-finished sketches came up quietly to the west room to be corrected, for a coin, by the foundling behind the locked door, and Mr. Frost could lay a flat, clean wash, and could not, to save his handsome neck, tell the true gray-blue of the underside of a leaf from the green of its face, and painted every petal the color he thought a flower ought to be rather than the color it was. Remember that. It is the whole of the story in one leaf. There was one afternoon in April, early, before Clemency had learned to guard her face, when Mr. Frost came up to the west room himself, uninvited, on the excuse of borrowing a badger brush, and he stood over the sloped table and looked at the plates already finished and drying on the rack, the foxglove and the wild rose and the first of the poppies, and his handsome face did a thing she had not seen it do before. It went still, and then hungry, and then careful, all in the space of one breath. He asked very lightly whether these were drawn from a pattern book or from the flowers themselves, and Clemency said only that she painted what she was set to paint, which was true and told nothing. He looked a while longer, and then he said, in the voice a certain kind of man keeps for tradespeople, that it was clever enough for shop work, and that she should mind she did not let the color go muddy, as such hands often did, and he took his badger brush and went. And Clemency, who had been reading people since she was a child, in a place where reading people was the difference between a supper and none, understood that Mr. Frost had come up to see whether the book was worth taking, and had gone away having decided that it was. She said nothing to anyone. But she began from that day to keep the finished plates turned face to the wall when she was not at them, and to carry the key of the west room on a cord under her stays, and these were small precautions, and they saved nothing in the end. But they told her a great deal about the house she was living in. If you have ever done the finest work of your life, and watched a handsomer person carry it into the light and take the bow for it, if you have ever known a thing to be true down to your bones, and known just as surely that you were the wrong person to be believed, then settle in by the fire with me now. And if this fireside is one you would sit at again, you know the small kindness that keeps the candles lit, and I am always glad of the company. Because what Julian Frost did with that book over the months that followed, and what one still room maid did about it in front of the whole county, is why they still talk in Hartwell of the day the herbal was unveiled at Wrenholt House. There was another afternoon that spring that Clemency kept differently, that she folded away in the same place where she kept the drawing of the columbine. The old countess had been failing all through May, and on a Thursday she came up slowly on Mrs. Quill's arm and would not sit, but stood by the table a long while looking at the finished plate of the columbine, which Clemency had painted last and best, the nodding head and the 5 violet spurs, and she put out one small dry finger and did not quite touch it, and she said, in a voice gone thin, that is the very flower, exactly that, no one else in England paints a columbine so it seems about to nod. And Clemency said, thank you, madam. And the old countess looked at her a long moment, sharp even then, and said, I did not say you painted it, child. I said no one else paints it. And there is a difference, and one day you will understand what I mean by it. And she went down again on Mrs. Quill's arm and left Clemency standing over the board, with her heart beating hard, because a foundling learns to hear the thing under the thing, and there had been a whole locked room under those few words, and Clemency had heard the door of it, though not yet what lay behind. The weeks went by, and the book grew under her hands the way a garden grows, slowly and then all at once. And the old countess came up every few days and sat by the table and watched and talked, more than a countess should to a hired brush, more than she talked to anyone in that house. She talked about a summer 60 years gone, when she had been young and had had a dear friend, a girl who could draw a flower so true that a great naturalist had once asked to buy her plates for the king's own collection, and how the friend had married for love beneath her station and been cast off by her family and driven out, and how the old countess had let it happen and said nothing, and had looked for the friend afterward for 40 years and never found her, and had carried the not looking hard enough of it like a stone in her shoe every day since. She never said the friend's name. She said only, once, near midsummer, with her small, hard hand flat on the edge of the slope table, that she was making this book to say a thing she had never had the courage to say while the person lived, and that when it was finished there would be a token laid in it, and Clemency was to place the token where no idle eye would find it and no careless hand disturb it, and it was to stay there, undisturbed, unless a day came when someone needed to know whose eye had truly seen these flowers. "Do you understand me, girl?" the old woman said. And Clemency, who understood a great deal more than she dared say, said only, "I will lay it where it will keep, madam." And she did. In August, by the light of one candle, with the old countess sitting up in her chair too weak now to hold so much as a pencil but watching every motion of her hands. A single flower pressed flat and dry, slipped in between two blank leaves near the back of the great book, a columbine of 5 spurred petals gone the soft brown of a pressed thing but whole, every part of it entire, and over the blank leaf that faced it, so faint it might have been a shadow on the paper, Clemency laid one thin wash of a color she had made herself and had told no one the making of, a violet drawn out of a berry that grew in one spinney of the Renholt land, and nowhere else she had ever found in all her seeking. A color that under an ordinary candle looked like nothing at all, like a smudge of damp on the page, and under the low slant of a morning sun woke and glowed like a bruise on the dawn. Remember that too. It is the second leaf of the story. The old countess died 9 days later, in her sleep, with the rug over her knees, and the house went into black, and the great book stood finished and bound in green morocco on its stand in the locked west room, and Clemency Ash, who had been paid £15 and given nothing else, and had expected nothing else, began to fold her color box to go back to the court behind the booksellers. She did not go, because on the 4th day after the funeral, Mrs. Quill came up to the west room, dry and exact, and said that Mr. Frost wished to see the book, and Clemency unlocked the door. And Mr. Julian Frost came in and stood before 14 months of another person's work with his hands folded and his handsome face composed, and looked at it a long time, turning the leaves slowly. And then he said, quite gently, quite reasonably, "You may go now. I will see it finished." There was nothing to finish. It was finished. Clemency said so, plainly, the way she said everything, and Mr. Frost smiled and said that, of course, the hired girl had done the labor, the grinding and the filling and the tedious washes, but that the drawings were his own, sketched in the field this last year and given over to a shop hand to color, and that it was he, Mr. Frost, who would present the book at the unveiling the family were planning for the autumn, before the whole county, as the old countess's commission and his own work of genius. And Clemency understood, standing there in her brown stuff gown with her color box under her arm, exactly what had been arranged. She had been hired to be a pair of hands and no face at all. The face had been chosen months ago, and it was a handsome one, and it belonged to a young man who had spent a whole season teaching this house to believe he was a genius with flowers, and now here was a masterpiece with no maker's name on any page of it, and a dead witness in the churchyard. And the only living witness was a foundling whose word against a connection of the family was worth precisely nothing. And everyone concerned knew it, And Mr. Frost's gentleness was the gentleness of a man who has already reckoned the cost to somebody else and found it a fair price. "You have your wages, Mr. Frost said. You have no complaint." And he was right, in law and in the world, and he held the door. Clemency went. But she did not go back to Hartwell. She took a place instead, quietly, through Mrs. Quill, who had watched the whole arrangement with her dry, exact face and said not one word for it or against it, but who found, that same week, that the still room at Wrenholt House wanted a careful woman who could also keep the great house's flowers and dry its herbs and press its simples. And so Clemency Ash went down 3 floors and out of the light and stayed in the house, drying lavender and pressing the Physic Garden's leaves between sheets of blotting paper, and told herself it was because the wage was steady, and knew in the honest middle of herself where a foundling keeps her few true things, that it was because she could not walk away and leave that book to tell a lie with her mother's eye looking out of every page of it, and could not yet say why she was so certain it was her mother's eye, and would not leave until she knew. The man had been at the funeral, though Clemency had not known who he was. She had seen him from the back of the church, tall and brown from the sun, and very still, while the rest of the county rustled and dabbed on cue. A man in plain deep black who stood through the whole service with his eyes on the old countess's coffin and his jaw set like a man paying a private debt. She learned afterward, from the servants' hall, that this was the old countess's great-nephew, the young Earl of Wrenholt, who had come into the title and the house and the guardianship of shy Lady Grace, all in one cold week. A man of 33, who had been 3 years abroad with a scientific expedition collecting plants for the great gardens at home, and had come back to a black house and a family he barely knew and a clever young connection, Mr. Frost, who had made himself charming to every corner of it in the Earl's long absence. The Earl of Wrenholt did not know one servant from another, and why should he? But he had a habit, unusual in a great man, of walking his own house at odd hours alone, learning it the way a man learns a country he has just landed in, and it was on one of these walks, a fortnight after the funeral, that he came through the still room passage at 10 at night with a candle, and found a young woman he did not know sitting up by a rushlight over a wide shallow press, laying out the leaves of some small plant between blotting sheets with a pair of ivory tweezers, so exactly and so patiently that not one leaf lay crooked. He stopped. He was not a man who stopped for servants, but he had spent 3 years among naturalists who lived and died by the accuracy of a drawing, and he had come home with an eye for the one true observation in a room full of pretty ones. And the one true thing in that passage at 10 at night was the ordered specimen taking shape under this woman's hands. He asked her, not unkindly, whether she was the one who kept the still room. She stood and said she was, and did not simper or shrink, and he looked at the pressed plant lying perfect under her tweezers, a common weed nobody troubled about, and said, "That is very careful work for a still room." And Clemency, who had decided months ago to be nobody, heard herself say before she could stop it, "It is only pressing, my lord. The seeing is upstairs." And then she caught herself, and bit the sentence off short, and said good night, and went, and left the Earl of Wrenholt standing in his own passage, with his candle and a splinter of something he could not name working its way in under his skin. The seeing is upstairs. He had understood the sentence perfectly, the way a man understands a sentence in a tongue he has not used in years but never quite forgets. And it cost him a night's sleep, because he had a book upstairs that the whole county was about to praise a certain young man for, And here in his own cold passage was a still-room maid he had never laid eyes on, laying out a weed with the exact patient truthfulness of the finest botanical hand he had seen in 3 years of traveling among the best of them. And the two facts sat side by side in his mind and would not be married. He had not asked her name. He went up to his study instead and sat by the dying fire until it went out, and thought about how he had come home from 3 years abroad with only one skill worth the keeping, which was the eye for the true line under the graceful one, and that eye had gone off like a struck bell in his own passage over the word seeing. He did not seek her out. An earl crossing his own house to a still-room maid is not a kindness, it is a scandal, and he knew it. And some part of him, though he could not have told you why, did not want this particular woman turned into a scandal. But he began quietly to notice. He noticed that the great herbal, which was to be the center of the unveiling the family were planning for October, was spoken of everywhere as Mr. Frost's triumph, and that Mr. Frost spoke of it himself, modestly, turning the praise aside so gracefully that it came back doubled. And he noticed, because he had begun to watch, that whenever the book was spoken of in the drawing-room the still-room maid, if she chanced to be passing with the herbs or the flowers for the table, went very quiet and very careful, and set down what she carried without a rattle, and left. He was a patient man. He had learned patience waiting 3 years for seeds to come up in strange soil. He did not ask. He watched, and he did a thing no one marked at the time, which was that he took himself one gray morning to the west room where the book was kept locked away, and turned its leaves alone in the north light, and came away white about the mouth. Because whatever else was true, the person who had painted these had knelt in the meadow too, had counted the freckles at the heart of the poppy, and grayed and blued the underside of every leaf exactly as the living plant demands, and no drawing master ever teaches. And Julian Frost, whose pretty folio the Earl had also seen, had plainly never in his life looked so hard at anything that could not look back and admire him. They spoke once more that autumn, and only once, and it was not by his design or hers. A hard early frost came down in September and threatened the last of the physic garden, the tender things the old countess had prized, and Clemency was out past dark with a lantern and armfuls of sacking, saving what could be saved of a bed of rare simples that were not even hers to save, and that no one had told her to save. And the Earl, walking his grounds as he walked his house, found her at it, kneeling in the cold with the lantern beside her, tucking the sacking round the roots of plants worth less than the candle end she was burning over them. He stood at the edge of the light a moment, and then he came into it, an earl, and knelt down in the frosted bed beside her and took up an end of the sacking, and neither of them said anything at all while they covered 3 more beds. And it was, he thought afterward, the most contented half-hour he had spent since he came home. At the end of it he said only, "You need not have troubled. These are the least of what we grow here." And Clemency, tucking the last corner, said, "They are the least in price, my lord, and the rarest in kind, and it is generally the rare and the low-priced things that get let die, because no one counts them worth the saving, and best to save the thing before there is any counting done." And he looked at her a moment in the lantern light, this maid who saved rare and worthless things in the cold at midnight, and asked nothing for it, and he said, "You speak as if you had made a study of what gets let die." And she said, "I was raised in a place where the cheap and the rare were let die together, and no one troubled to tell them apart." And then she caught herself, having said more to this man in 2 sentences than she had said to the whole servants' hall in 3 months. And she rose, and bade him good night, and he let her go, and went up to his study, and took out a letter he had begun a week before to a botanist he had known abroad and had not yet sent. A letter that asked a single careful question, and read it over again, and this time he sealed it and sent it. The autumn drew on toward the day of the unveiling, and it came down on Wrenholt House like a tide. For 3 days the great house dressed itself, black crape put away, the long library cleared, hothouse flowers brought in by the cartload, and over all of it the particular bright hum of a house making ready to be looked at by everyone whose looking counts for anything. The county came, by carriage and by the score, all the names that governed that part of England by land or by blood, and they came to honor the old countess and, more honestly, to see the famous book and the famous Mr. Frost and the shy young heiress who was to receive the one from the hands of the other. The book was brought down at last from the west room and set open on a stand in the middle of the long library under the best light the day afforded, and the county gathered round it and made the sound a crowd makes over something truly fine, a low sound, almost a sigh, and Mr. Julian Frost stood beside it in a bottle-green coat, with his hands folded and his handsome head a little bowed, accepting, deflecting, glowing, and Clemency Ash, who had been kept below all day drying and fetching and arranging the very hothouse flowers the county now trod past, was sent up at the last with a tray of cordial water for the ladies, and came in by the servants' door at the back, and stood in her brown stuff gown with her pigment-stained hands round a tray, and watched the whole assembly of the county bend over 14 months of her own seeing and call it by another person's name. She might have borne it. She had meant to bear it. She had told herself 100 times over the autumn that the work was done and true, whether or not her name stood in it, that a still-room maid who opened her mouth in that room would be turned out by nightfall and rightly, in the world's eyes, and the shop with the east window gone forever. She had the whole speech of her own silence by heart. She had it word for word as she stood at the back with the tray, and she watched the county move round the open book like water round a stone. And she heard the Dowager Lady Sarn say to a bishop's wife that she had never in 70 years seen a poppy painted to look so nearly alive, and she heard Mr. Frost, 3 yards off, say modestly that he had spent many patient hours in the meadow to catch it, and Clemency's hands tightened on the tray and did not spill a drop, because a still-room maid who spills does not keep her place. She looked once for the Earl, and found him where he had been all day, by the tall window, not moving, not admiring, watching the room the way she had once watched the morning light, and she did not know that he was waiting, that he had chosen not to fire the first shot himself precisely so that when it came, it would come from the one direction the county could not laugh away, which was the direction of the maker. She only saw a great man standing apart, and thought him proud, and looked away and held her tray, and kept her speech of silence by heart. And then Mr. Frost, warming to his audience, made the one move too many that pride always makes. He turned the leaves of the book for the Dowager, slowly, to the Columbine, the last plate and the best, the nodding head and the 5 violet spurs, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry to the duchesses in the front rank, that this one was his own particular favorite, that he had sat a whole June morning by the river to draw it from the living stem, that he could still call to mind the very light on the water as he worked. And shy Lady Grace, who stood pale beside him, and who loved that river and that flower and had watched it grow on the page all one spring, said, in a small, clear voice that carried further than she meant it to, "But, Mr. Frost, the columbine by our river is white." And there was a small silence, and Mr. Frost laughed easily and touched the girl's shoulder and said, "So it is, my dear, in the common sort, but the artist may heighten a little for the beauty of the thing, One cannot hold a picture to the dull truth of a weed. And he said it to the whole county with his handsome head high. And 30 people smiled at the pretty saying, and somewhere at the back of the room a still room maid set down her tray. Because it was not heightened. Clemency had painted the columbine by the river, and it was violet. The true deep violet of that one flower that grew in that one damp spinney above the river bend, and nowhere else on the Wrenholt land. The very spinney whose berries gave up the secret color she had washed onto the hidden page, and Julian Frost, who had never in his life knelt by that river or any other, had just called the truest thing in the whole book a lie for the sake of a graceful turn of phrase, and had done it out of a mouth that swore it had sat a June morning drawing the very flower it did not know the color of. Clemency did not decide to do it. That is the truth, and she said so afterward. She did not weigh the shop with the east window against her mother's eye and choose between them. Her feet simply carried her, the way her hand had carried itself in the still room passage months before, and she crossed the long library in her brown gown between the satins and the jewels, and the county turned to see what servant had forgotten her place, and she stopped before the book, and she did not look at Mr. Frost at all. She looked at the Earl of Wrenholt, who stood very still by the tall window with his jaw set, and she said, in a voice that did not shake, "Forgive me, my lord. There is a way to know." There was a silence with an edge on it. Mr. Frost's smile did not move, but something behind it did, the way ice moves before it cracks. A footman started forward, and the Earl lifted one finger, and the footman stopped, and the Earl said, quietly, "Go on." And Clemency Ash, foundling, 23, in a brown stuff gown before the whole county, said the thing she had carried all autumn. "The person who made this book," she said, "painted the columbine by the river as it truly is, which is violet, not white. And Lady Grace is right that the common columbine is white, and the maker is right that this one is not. And there are only 2 people in England who ever knew why, and one of them is in that churchyard, and the other is standing before you now." And she made it a second way, she said. "On the blank leaf that faces the pressed flower, near the back of this book, there is a wash of color that no candle will show you, and no other hand in England could have laid, because it is drawn from a berry that grows in one spinney of your lordship's land, and I ground it myself, and told the making to no living soul. Carry the book to that window, my lord, to the low light of the morning, and turn to the pressed columbine near the back, and look at the leaf beside it, and the color that is nothing by candle will wake and glow, and it will be the same violet as the flower by the river, and Mr. Frost, who says the river columbine is white, cannot have laid a hidden color he does not know is there to prove a flower he has never seen the true face of. Take the book to the light. It knows what I know. The room did what rooms do. It froze, and then it began, very quietly, to lean. Mr. Frost recovered first, and beautifully. He gave a small pained laugh and said that the poor creature was overwrought, that the girl had ground the colors and filled the tedious washes and had plainly persuaded herself of a great deal more, that it was cruel of them all to have let a servant of unsound fancy near so grand an occasion, and that, of course, a wash that shows only by some particular light was the very sort of thing a disordered mind invents, and that in any case one had only to consider the source, a foundling with no name and no witness, against, and here he opened his hands to the whole shining room, all of this. It was well done. In 100 houses it would have been enough. The word of a connection of the family, gently spoken, against the word of a nameless still-room maid. And the maid turned out by morning and the book safe, and the county home to its dinner untroubled. It was enough for everyone in the room except the 3 people who had spent the season watching. Mrs. Quill, dry and exact by the wall, said, in a voice like a drawer sliding home, "There is a pressed flower near the back, and there is a color on the page beside it." I saw her carry the token up to her ladyship in August, and her ladyship sent me from the room while it was laid in, and told me after that she had made a thing right at last, and that the proof of it was where only the right eyes would find it. I will swear to the flower and the page. I will not swear to what the color does in the light, for I am no painter. But they are there, near the back, and this gentleman turned every leaf of this book not an hour ago, and never once found them, which a maker could not fail to do. And shy Lady Grace, white and trembling, said, in her small, clear voice, "The columbine by our river is violet. I have gathered it every June of my life. Mr. Frost, you told me you drew it, and you did not know its color, and I knew. And I said nothing because I thought myself a child and ignorant, and I was not." And then the Earl of Renholt moved. He crossed to the stand, and he took up the great book in both hands, green morocco and all its 14 months of pages, and he carried it not to the middle of the room where the best daylight fell for showing things off, but to the tall east window where the low autumn sun came in level and gold and honest, the same light a foundling had chosen her table by for 8 years, because it does not flatter. And he laid the book open on the sill and turned the leaves toward the back with the care of a man handling a thing that might go off. And he found the pressed columbine, brown and whole between 2 leaves, and he turned to the blank facing page that any eye by candlelight would have called empty, and he tilted it to the level of the sun. And there is a particular silence a room makes when it is watching to see whether the impossible will come true or not. The county made it. For the length of a breath there was nothing, only a white page in a window. And then the low sun found the wash, and the color woke, the way a bruise wakes on the dawn, a deep and living violet spreading up out of the paper where there had been nothing, glowing, unmistakable, the exact violet of a flower that grows in one spinney of the Renholt land, laid there by a hand that alone in all of England knew the making of it, in a place no living soul but the maker could have known to look. There is another silence a room makes when it has just watched the impossible become a plain fact. The county made that one too. Mr. Frost made a sound, small and involuntary, and did not make another. The Earl stood with the book open to the light and did not look at the color any longer. He had seen enough. He looked at Clemency, and then he did a thing that told the whole county where the case had gone, which was that he carried the book, open still, across that whole silent room to the oldest person present, old Sir Marcus Vane, 80 and half deaf and honest as chalk, who had known the king's own botanist in his day, and he put it in the old man's hands in the light, and said loudly, "For everyone, sir, tell the room what you see, so that no man may say I said it for them." And old Sir Marcus held the page to the window, and put up his glass, and looked a long while, and then he said, in the flat carrying voice of the very deaf, who cannot hear themselves and so cannot soften anything, "Well, there's a color here that was ground from a plant, not bought from a shop, and I know the difference, for I have ground a few in my time, and it's a color I never saw for sale in London or Paris either, and it shows by the raking light and hides by the candle, which is a maker's trick and a rare good one, and no man lays a hidden signature into the back of a book he only came to steal. Whoever put that there made the book. That's plain enough." And he lowered the glass and looked over it at the room and said, "Into a silence you could have cut and mounted. Now which of you is the maker?" And Clemency Ash stood in the middle of the long library and did not hear the county begin to murmur. or see Mr. Frost's handsome face go the color of the blank page, or notice that shy Lady Grace had begun quietly to cry. She was looking at nothing, and she was 9 years old again at a parish gate with a drawing of a columbine in her hands. 5 spurred petals drawn in a way the matron could not name. Every stamen counted true, and she understood at last, all in one breath, whose eye had taught her eye, across a gap of 2 graves, without either of them ever knowing. Her mother's flower, her grandmother's meadow, painted by a countess into a book to wait for her. But she did not yet know the whole of it, and the whole of it was still to come, for old Sir Marcus, turning the leaves back the way he had come, had reached the first page of the book, where the old countess had caused a line to be printed under the title long before, and had never let anyone read it aloud, and he read it now in his flat, honest voice, not knowing what he held. It said that this florilegium was drawn and colored by the true and only hand of the young paintress Clemency Ashe of Hartwell, and by no other, that not one flower in it was any other person's seeing or labor, and that the old Countess of Renholt set this down under her own hand because she had learned, too late, and to her lasting grief, how a house may let a true maker go unnamed and a young heiress go uncomforted, and would not have it happen twice beneath her roof. And then, on the leaf beneath, the old countess had written the thing she had truly locked away, the real gift, and old Sir Marcus read that out too, in the same flat voice, not knowing what he did to the room. It said that the flowers in this book were not the old countess's own choosing after all. They were the very flowers, in the very order of their blooming, that had been drawn 60 years before by the friend of her youth, the girl the family had cast out for marrying a poor music master, and whom the old countess had failed to defend and failed for 40 years to find. The friend's name had been Susanna, and the old countess had written, in her failing hand, that she had found her at the very last, not the woman, for the woman was long dead in want, but her child given to a parish in a hard year, and her grandchild coloring plates in a shop in Hartwell, with the family eye alive in her hands, and no notion of whose blood carried it, and that she had brought that grandchild into the house under a plain gray gown to make one last book together. The flowers of the lost friend, seen again by the lost friend's own granddaughter, so that the thing which had been driven out might come home into the light at last. Her name, the writing ended, is Clemency Ashe, and she does not know what she is, and I had not the courage to tell her to her face, and so I have laid the truth in the back of the book where truth belongs, between the pages, under a color only her own hand could wake, waiting for the day it is wanted. It is wanted now. Old Sir Marcus lowered the book and looked over his glass and said, into a silence past all cutting, "Well, that is plainer still." Clemency stood very straight in the middle of the room and put her stained hands together, and was, for the first time in 23 years, exactly where she came from. She did not weep. That came later, alone and hard. It was shy Lady Grace who moved first among the family, before her guardian, before anyone. She crossed the room in her pale gown with the tears still bright on her face, past the county that had come to watch her honored, and she stopped in front of the still-room maid who was not a still-room maid. And she did a thing no one had told her to do, and no one could have stopped her doing, which was to take Clemency's roughened, pigment-stained hands in both of her own soft ones and say, in her small, clear voice that carried to the very back of the room, "Then you are my cousin, and I have been letting you carry trays." And the county, which had come ready to enjoy a fine scandal, found itself instead watching a gentle girl of 16 claim her own blood in front of everyone, and the appetite for cruelty went out of the room like a candle pinched between two fingers. Clemency looked at the girl she had watched love her garden all one spring, the girl who had told the truth about a white flower without knowing what her truth would do, and she said, "Lo, I am glad it was you who said it, my lady, for it was your one honest word about the color that opened the door." And Lady Grace wept harder and laughed at once, and would not let go of her hands, and that was the moment the county chose to remember afterward, more even than the color in the window, the shy heiress, and the foundling standing hand in hand in the middle of the long room, while a dead countess's truth settled over them all like the first still light of a morning. It was the Earl of Renholt who moved again, because someone had to, and because he had known for weeks what was coming. He turned to the county and said, in a voice used to being the last word, that 6 weeks past he had written to a botanist he had known abroad, and had asked one question, which was whether any drawing master or academy in England taught a pupil to gray and blue the underside of a leaf, as the living plant truly shows and no book instructs. And the answer, which he had kept since, was that no school teaches it, that it comes only from a hand that has knelt by the living flower for years and looked harder than love, and that he had then turned every leaf of this book and found that hand on every page, and had found in Mr. Frost's own folio no such hand anywhere in it, only a pretty one that painted flowers the color it thought they ought to be. "I have known who made this book since Michaelmas," he said. "I did not speak it, because it was not mine to give, and because a truth that proves itself before witnesses is worth 100 of a great man's word. It has proven itself." Then he turned to Julian Frost, and the whole county turned with him, and here the story might have become a cruelty, for the world dearly loves to watch pride go down. It did not. The Earl of Renholt looked at the young man who had charmed his house for a season, and he did not raise his voice, and he said only, "You will leave Renholt House before dark, Mr. Frost, and you will do it quietly, for my cousin Grace's sake, who trusted you and does not deserve a scene to remember this day by. What you have done in this room is between you and your own conscience, and I judge it will be company enough. Go and pack." And that was all. Julian Frost opened his mouth and looked at the line printed under the title in the old countess's own naming, and at Mrs. Quill dry and immovable by the wall, and at old Sir Marcus with the book still in his honest hands, and at the whole cold county waiting to see what he would do. And he found there was nothing to say that would not make it worse, and so he inclined his handsome head, and turned, and walked the length of that room alone with his back straight, which was the one thing left him, and went out and out of the county before the month was done, to a cousin in another shire where the story had not yet traveled, though it traveled everywhere in the end, as such stories do. It was Clemency who ended the cruelty of it, though, and the county remembered that longest of all. As Mr. Frost reached the door, she said, not loudly, Mr. Frost and the young man stopped without turning, and she said, "You lay a clean, flat wash. Very few can." It was true, and it was the only kind thing that could honestly be said, and she said it because her own grandmother had been driven out of a great house once with nothing, and she would not send even the man who had robbed her through that same door with quite nothing, and Julian Frost stood one moment in the doorway with his back to the room. And then he went, and no one ever knew what his face did, which was the last mercy of the day. Shy Lady Grace received the book in the end, though not that autumn, for the house was in mourning and the great gathering was let go by, but the next spring, quietly, when the river columbines came up violet along the bend, and it was Clemency Ash who put it into her cousin's hands, and Clemency Ash who showed her the pressed flower near the back and the color that wakes in the low light, and the little told secret of how it was made, and the small brown pressed columbine and the page beside it were left exactly as they were, because Lady Grace said the book should always carry the mark of the day it told the truth, and no one argued with her, for she was gentle, but she was. It turned out her grandmother's girl. The county tried, in the weeks that followed, to make a great romantic tale of it at once. The foundling revealed. The Earl and the paintress, and Clemency disappointed them, because she did not become anything overnight. The old countess had left, in a codicil no one had thought to open, a sum of money to the paintress Clemency Ash, quietly, set apart from the book and the naming, enough for a shop. The county, hearing of the codicil, expected Clemency to leap at once into gentility, to put off the brown gown and take up the character of a lost heiress, and she disappointed them again, for she had thought a great deal, over one hard season in a still room, about what happens to a person who is lifted rather than one who climbs, and she wanted no floor under her that she had not laid herself. So she thanked the family, and refused the offer of rooms at the great house, and refused, more gently, Lady Grace's tearful plea that she stay and be a cousin in satins, and she took the codicil money and did with it the one thing she had wanted since she was 15 at an east window. She opened a shop in Hartwell, a good window and an east light, and over the door, in gilt letters large enough for a workhouse matron to read from clear across the street, the name Ash, and under it, in smaller letters, painter of flowers from the living stem, because she would not sell a picture of a flower she had not seen alive, and the trade came. First the naturalists, and then the great gardeners, and at last the very county that had come to Gop. For once the world knows a hand cannot lie, it will pay a good deal to be told the truth about a rose. As for the Earl of Renholt, he did the one thing a patient man does, which is nothing, for a long while and correctly. He did not offer for the still room maid the week she was shown to be a lost heiress of the brush, because a woman lifted up in a single afternoon by a great man's hand is not lifted at all, only moved, and he had learned abroad the difference between the two. He waited. He let her open her shop and make it prosper and stand on her own ground, and he came to Hartwell on business that was not quite business, and bought botanical plates he did not need, and stood in the east light like a fool, as he later admitted, watching a woman lay down the true gray blue of the underside of a leaf. He was not idle in his waiting. He brought her, that first summer, a thing worth more to her than any offer, which was a chest of papers his lawyers had turned up in the settling of the old countess's affairs, the record of a marriage 60 years gone between a gentleman's daughter named Susanna and a music master with no fortune, and the parish register of a child born to them and given up in a hard year, and the thin hard proof in ink and dates that the foundling Clemency Ash was who a dying countess had said she was. He laid it on the counter under the east window and said, "This is yours, and I bring it to you and not to a court, because it is your name, and you should be the first to hold it." And Clemency read the pages slowly, in the light that does not lie, and found her grandmother's married name, and her mother's birth and her own beneath it, set down at last in a hand that was not the workhouse matron's. And she laid one pigment-stained finger on the line where her mother's name was written and kept it there a long while, and said only, "So there was a name all along." And the Earl said, "There was always a name." The world was simply not looking, and it was a full year and more before he said the thing he had carried since a still room passage at 10 at night. He said it in the shop, in the east window, and he was not an earl at all when he said it. He said, Miss Ash, I have bought a great many plates I shall never look at, and I have a house full of pictures that do not need correcting, and I have run clean out of pretexts, and I find I do not want any more of them. For the truth is, I have loved you since a night I found the one honest thing in a house full of pretty lies, and I did not know your name, and it did not signify, because I knew your eye. And a man may build a whole life on an eye that will not lie to him, even when the lie would be kinder. He said he was not offering a rescue, for she had rescued herself before the whole county and wanted nothing from him. He was asking, he said, whether she might do him the honor of joining her name to his, not because he was an earl and she had turned out to be an heiress of the brush, but because they were the only two people either of them had ever met who could not, to save their lives, paint a false color and call it true. And Clemency Ash, who had faced down a whole county without her hands shaking, found them shaking now over the board, and set the brush down, and said, My lord, I am a foundling, with a shop. And he said, I know. It is the foundlings who know the exact worth of a home, having had to make their own. And she laughed and wept and said yes, in her own light, at her own hour, on her own ground. They were married in the little church at Hartwell, not the great one, at her asking, and shy Lady Grace wept happily in the front pew, and Mrs. Quill stood dry and exact, and for once plainly and openly pleased. And if you go to Hartwell now, you may still see the shop with the good window and the name in gilt over the door. And if you go in on a quiet morning, you may find the Countess of Wrenholt herself at the east window with a foundling girl from the parish beside her, the way an old countess once sat beside a foundling, teaching a pair of young hands to gray and blue the underside of a leaf, and to grind a true color, and never once to paint a flower the color it ought to be instead of the color it is. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, I am glad you were here for it. Tell me in the comments which moment you would have crossed that room for. The still room maid setting down her tray and walking into the light, or the low sun waking a hidden color on a page a whole county had called empty. And tell me too what town or what country you are listening from, because this fireside reaches farther every week, and I do like to know how far the candles carry. Next Thursday, another door opens on another woman the world refused to see. A lady's companion this time, and a locked cabinet, and a ledger that everyone believed until the night its own figures stood up and testified, and it is waiting for you when you are ready. The shop in Hartwell stands quiet now on such mornings, the board wiped clean, the colors put by in their box. But in the east window, where the light does not lie, a single sheet lies half finished, a columbine of 5 spurred petals, and up from the base of every violet spur the true color deepens, petal by petal, laid down at last by a hand that knows exactly whose eye first learned to see it.